There's a country where the government takes almost half of everything you earn, where a company can lay you off with almost no warning, where there's no legally required minimum wage, none, by law. And that same country is one of the richest, most stable, most livable places on Earth. If that sounds like a contradiction, it's because everyone keeps trying to force it into one of two boxes, capitalism or socialism. But what if the real answer was never about picking a side? It was about building a system flexible enough to bend without breaking. Stick around, because by the end of this video, that idea is going to make a lot more sense than it does right now. Strip away all the politics, and the core disagreement is simple. Capitalism says, let people own things, compete, and keep the reward. The market decides what gets made and who gets rich. Socialism says, let the people collectively own the means of production. So wealth doesn't concentrate in a few hands, and workers stop being squeezed by the people who own the machines. Put more bluntly, capitalism doesn't owe anything to the people it leaves behind. Left alone, it produces enormous private wealth next to real inequality. Socialism's answer removes the profit motive, but strip out competition and personal reward, and you strip out the reason anyone works harder or innovates. Neither flaw is theoretical. Both showed up in real countries at full scale. That second idea wasn't invented out of nowhere. Early industrial capitalism was brutal. 12-hour shifts, child labor, workers who built enormous fortunes for factory owners while barely surviving on the wage they were paid. Socialism's core accusation, that raw capitalism concentrates wealth upward and treats people as an input cost, wasn't propaganda. It was an accurate description. For most of the 20th century, these two ideas were treated like a fight with only one winner. The Soviet Union tried the socialist experiment. It collapsed in 1991 under the weight of broken incentives and chronic shortages. It was a rigid system that couldn't correct itself once it started cracking. So the story most people were told is simple. Capitalism won. Except, look at the countries capitalism supposedly won with. The debt burden, the inflation. Most of them still tax heavily, still fund healthcare, pensions, and unemployment support, still bail out banks when things go wrong, and it's usually ordinary households on Main Street left holding the damage, while institutions get rescued first. That's not an accident, and it wasn't kindness from the top. Organized workers and political pressure forced it. Back in 1929, unregulated capitalism produced its own catastrophe, the Great Depression. Banks failed. A quarter of the workforce sat idle. Governments didn't abandon markets afterward, but they stopped leaving them alone, adding insurance, regulation, social security, and public safety nets. In practice, they absorbed the demands socialists had been making for decades. Capitalism survived by borrowing the parts of socialism it could no longer afford to ignore. And when capitalism runs into trouble now, the fixes rarely look like a Depression-era bank run anymore. They look like printing money, quantitative easing, emergency lending facilities, terms most people have heard but couldn't actually explain. That's not always an accident either. The more complicated the rescue sounds, the fewer people ask who's really paying for it. So if capitalism really won outright, why does almost every successful capitalist country still look a little bit socialist around the edges? That question is where this story actually gets interesting. And nowhere answers it better than a handful of small countries in Northern Europe. So are these small countries socialist or capitalist? Here's the myth to kill. Scandinavia did not get rich by rejecting capitalism, and it didn't become stable by rejecting socialism either. As these countries industrialized, two powerful groups showed up at the same time. The people who owned the factories and the people who worked in them. Owners didn't offer workers a seat at the table voluntarily. It took strikes, lockouts, and real-class conflict before capital had no choice left but to negotiate as an equal, instead of simply dictating terms. What actually happened next is stranger and more interesting. Sweden gave the world Volvo, Ericsson, IKEA. Denmark built shipping and pharmaceutical giants. These are private companies, competing, earning profit, same as anywhere else. Nobody nationalized the furniture industry, but nobody let the furniture industry write the rules alone either. In Sweden, that moment of forced negotiation came in 1938, with an agreement between the country's main employer association and its trade unions signed in a small coastal town called Saltsjöbaden. Instead of the government deciding wages by law, businesses and workers would negotiate directly, sector by sector, contract by contract, almost like thousands of small treaties running at once instead of one giant law trying to cover everyone. That decision is still shaping the region. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway don't even have a national minimum wage written into law. Wages are set by these ongoing negotiations instead. The state isn't pulling every lever. It's just making sure both sides stay at the table year after year, contract after contract. Now, here's the part that breaks the fantasy version of this story. None of this is free. Denmark's tax take is among the highest on earth. Over 45% of the entire economy flows through the government, and that money isn't coming from a handful of billionaires getting squeezed. Middle-income workers pay real income tax. Everyday purchases carry real consumption tax. This is the price of the stability they've built. Compare that to what usually happens in most capitalist countries. The ultra-rich and large corporations often pay proportionally less than the middle class, routed through offshore accounts and tax havens built specifically to make sure the biggest fortunes contribute the least. Denmark's system doesn't really let that happen at scale. Everyone, including the business owners, pays into the same pool. Here's what that actually looks like over a lifetime. A typical worker in Denmark will hand over roughly half of everything they ever earned to the government. Over an entire career, that's easily hundreds of thousands of dollars. In most countries, losing that much money would sound like a disaster. In Denmark, it's just Tuesday, and the difference is what they get handed back in return, quietly for their entire life. The honest version of the Nordic deal isn't the rich pay so everyone else gets free stuff. It's closer to almost everyone pays more, and in exchange, almost everyone is covered when life goes wrong. To be clear, none of this is free, and no one is pretending it is. Think of it like the difference between paying for a car repair out of pocket the day the engine dies versus paying a little into a maintenance plan. Same total cost, roughly. Completely different experience of getting hit with it. Healthcare isn't free. University isn't free. Someone is always paying. The only thing that changes is when. You're not avoiding the cost. You're just not getting hit all at once. Instead of a medical bill arriving the week you get sick, or tuition bill the year your kid turns 18, the cost gets spread out. This next part is the one Americans usually find hardest to believe. In Denmark, firing someone is relatively easy. A company doesn't have to justify keeping a shrinking department alive just to avoid the paperwork of letting people go. If a business needs to cut from 5,000 employees down to 3,500, it can actually do that. In most political conversations, that sounds like the scary, cold, corporate version of capitalism, the one socialism was supposed to protect you from. Here's the twist. Denmark isn't trying to protect the job. It's trying to protect the person. Think of it less like a country trying to keep every boat from ever taking on water, and more like a country that stopped pretending it could stop the water, and built a life raft for absolutely everyone on board instead. If your position disappears, there's real unemployment support, real retraining programs, real help finding the next job. The economy is still allowed to move and change. It just doesn't leave people to sink when it does. Denmark actually has a name for this: flexicurity, flexibility for companies, security for workers. Two ideas that most people assume can't coexist, sitting right next to each other on purpose. If this all sounds too clean, good, because it hasn't always worked. In the early 1990s, Sweden hit a real crisis. A credit boom collapsed. Property prices crashed. Banks came under serious pressure. Unemployment climbed and government finances went deep into the red. This is the part of the story that actually matters most. Because Sweden didn't respond by saying, "This is the Swedish model, we must never change it." It ripped parts of its own system open and rebuilt them. Markets got freed up in certain sectors. The tax code was reworked. New fiscal rules forced tighter discipline going forward. The pension system was redesigned so it wouldn't quietly go bankrupt as the population aged. That's the actual secret ingredient. Not the taxes, not the unions, not even the safety net itself. It's that when the numbers stopped working, the country was willing to change the model instead of defending it out of pride. Compare that to what happened on the other side of this whole debate. When the Soviet system started failing in its final decades, it couldn't correct itself the same way. Because admitting the plan was broken, and admitting the entire political structure was broken too. Rigid systems protect the system. Adaptive systems protect the people inside it. And capitalist democracies aren't automatically immune to that same instinct. When the numbers turn bad heading into an election, the temptation isn't usually to admit it. It's to reframe it and delay the bad headline. The impulse, protect the people in charge before protecting the people affected, is the same one, just wearing a suit instead of a uniform. None of this makes the Nordic countries a finished utopia. Populations are aging, and immigration integration has been genuinely difficult. Housing in the bigger cities is painfully expensive. This is a real economy with real trade-offs, not a fairy tale with the ending already written. There's one more piece of this puzzle, and it's the one that turns the whole model from smart into almost unfair. Norway struck oil, a lot of it. That's pure luck, not policy. Plenty of countries find oil and end up no richer for it. Norway did something different. Instead of treating the windfall like a bonus paycheck, it built a national fund and started routing revenue straight into it. Oil is a resource that runs out eventually. The fund that oil money bought doesn't have to. It's the difference between winning the lottery and blowing it in a year versus turning it into an account that pays for generations. Oil gave Norway the opportunity. What it did with that opportunity is the actual lesson. So what actually is this? It's clearly not the socialism people picture. Private companies compete, fail, and make people rich here just like anywhere else. But it's not the unregulated capitalism its defenders like to imagine either. The version with no unions, no safety net, no floor under anyone. That version already existed once. It produced child labor, mass poverty next to enormous private fortunes, and a global depression. Nobody has to imagine what capitalism left alone looks like. History already ran that experiment, and it failed the people living inside it. What actually happened in Scandinavia is that socialist pressure won the argument about fairness. Workers deserve real bargaining power. Healthcare shouldn't depend on luck. Unemployment shouldn't mean ruin. Without socialism winning the argument about ownership, capital stayed private, but it was forced, through decades of organizing, to share the table instead of owning it outright. This isn't a tidy compromise between two equal ideologies. Capitalism only became livable once it was forced to absorb socialism's core critique. The companies still generate the wealth. Nobody pretends anymore that the market gets to decide, alone, what happens to the people it leaves behind. To be fair, defenders of freer markets say this security has a price, high taxes, and a state that must be trusted not to fail. But even they have to explain why no successful capitalist economy on Earth ever chose to run without any of these guardrails at all. So picture that country again. Taxes eating half of every paycheck, layoffs that happen fast, no legal minimum wage, and still one of the richest. For 100 years, the world argued about which system deserved to win, capitalism or socialism, markets or the state, freedom or security. The answer was that the argument itself was the mistake. It's what happens when a country asks what keeps people standing when the ground shifts. The system doesn't need purity. It needs the willingness to change. Subscribe and let me know. Does a system like this sound sustainable to you?